The city was a murmuration of light caught in a storm glass, a lattice of lanes and towers that glittered without rest. Air bore the metallic taste of ozone and rain that never fell, the sky a ceiling of arranged traffic and pulsing advertisements. Somewhere below, somewhere within, the temple burned. Somewhere above, 1,000 arguments had already been silenced by the stroke of a single decree. The roar of Coruscant's perpetual evening pressed like a weight upon the ribcage, heavy, mechanical, saturated with breath that was not breath, but vapor and fuel, with heartbeats that were not hearts, but engines that had convinced themselves they were. Yoda stood in a passage where light did not settle. The walls sweated with the hum of conduits. The stone beneath his feet was older than the Republic and kept its coolness like a hidden truth. Everything else had been claimed by heat. He had turned from the path that would have led him away through ducts and blind corridors and secret lifts, away to a waiting craft bearing friends who had begun to call themselves by a word that felt both hopeful and bleak. Survivors, they had said, and the syllables had dislodged gravel in his chest. Forward, backward. There was a meaning in those directions once. Now there was only toward and away. He closed his eyes, and the living force pressed close like damp moss. It did not happen as a voice, not most of the time, but it arrived as pattern, as the felt sense of how currents might run if one placed a hand here, a word there. Sometimes it was a syllable that made his bones ring, and when that happened, it was because a friend had remembered how to speak across the seam between voice and quiet. He listened for the one whose memory felt like warm rain and stubborn laughter. Find the small place, the other had shown him once, in a moment that had not needed speech. Be with what breathes close to the ground. From there, the great is not so great. The great had revealed itself. Its name had been spoken tirelessly within the Senate, wrapped in gratitude and fear. The great had worn a human face that smiled with a patient sorrow, as if it bore every pain on behalf of the foolish multitudes. The great had bowed and asked for the last of their trust. And the great had not been great at all, only ravenously certain. Yoda placed his palm upon the wall. The chill bled into his skin. The map of the Senate complex unfurled behind his eyelids. Chambers nested within chambers, rails, galleries, the long throat of a lift shaft. The gullet of the central rotunda displayed like the cross-section of some impossible organ. He could feel where the clones traveled in their squads, the long silver pulse of their synchronization. He could feel where the Chancellor stood alone in the eye of a storm he himself had called, alone and never alone, because he was a knot of intention thickened over years, until it was almost a thing you might touch. He was not going to run. He knew what running would do. It would keep the order alive in bodies for a little longer, and it would bury the truth deeper. It would say to the galaxy, there is no center but fear. He could look at the shape of that future. It was drawn like a sand garden, raked in a circle until the circle was small enough to swallow a person whole. He breathed. The choice arrived already made, as some choices do. He went toward the rotunda. In the corridors that led there, the light always seemed a fraction late to its own arrival, as if it had been asked to hesitate. The air chilled with the stored breath of 1,000 debates. A droid crossed his path without registering him, its tray loaded with empty cups that smelled of tannin and the sweetness of fruit rind, the remnants of speeches and negotiations already metabolized. His steps made no sound against the stone, but the stone knew his presence. Awareness slid like a shawl over his shoulders as he entered the vestibule. Guards not of flesh but of programming, lenses, sensors, the gaze of architecture. He could have chosen to approach as a shadow. He had long practice. But that would have been another corridor belonging to fear. He approached as himself. He did not step into the rotunda so much as allow it to fit around him. The dome arced above like a night sky tuned to an instrument's perfect curve. The air smelled faintly of metal and rain. Pods in their thousands reposed within the walls, like seeds sleeping in a fruit. And at the very center, a platform rose with a grace that tried to persuade the observer of its benignity. A figure waited there in the posture of someone receiving homage. "Master Yoda," the figure said, and reverberation gave the greeting a gentle grandeur. "It warms an old man's heart to see you. I confess I feared you might lose your way." The smile was solicitous. The eyes had perfected a shine that meant kindness and had never known it. Yoda allowed his gaze to climb the steps at the center of the chamber until it rested upon the man whom a galaxy had named necessary. The light found the furrows in that face, the sag with which it hid its appetite, the smallness of the mouth that had spoken so expansively. Even now, the deception worked upon the senses, if one permitted them to be led. "Lost my way, I have not," Yoda said, and the syllables were stones set into a path. "Found you, I have." Silence gathered like cloth. A twitch decorated the corner of the Chancellor's mouth. The way one sometimes readjusts a mask one has forgotten is a mask. "Then we're in an agreement. One can only hope in time the rest of your order will see what you now see." There were no clone guards within the chamber. Yoda had noticed that absence before he had arrived. It was the quietness that had made him trust he had chosen correctly. This place, the heart of the apparatus, was a sanctum. He was not to be interrupted. The duel in the office had been the prelude, the skin testing the thorn. Here, the thorn would be driven into the palm. "See, I do," Yoda said. Clouded the path was. Clarified now, it is. The small light behind the Chancellor's eyes cooled in a way not perceptible to anyone who had not spent their lifetime watching the places where color goes when speech becomes poison. The lips softened into a look of pity. "Then you know what must happen." Yoda bowed, not in submission but the way storm-gnarled branches bow under their own memories. "I do." The Chancellor's mouth changed shape. He did not reach for his weapon at once, and that was a kind of courtesy, a declaration that he, too, intended to allow the forms of language the first passage. "It is a tragedy," he said, and his voice was a warmth that had been taught to behave like the sun. Truly, had the Jedi not clung so fiercely to their... well, it hardly matters now. It is better this way. The Republic will be safe. The people will finally... The blue light of a blade thawed out of nothing in Yoda's hand. The Uder's eyes brightened with joy that had never met compassion. "Ah," said the Chancellor, and the arc of crimson tore into being as if the name he had pretended to wear all these years were a husk he was finally permitted to shed. 8. Last. They did not move gladly. Each belonged to a seriousness that could not be called glad. But there was a rightness that connected their bodies to the scale of what this was. The first blow had the feel of ceremony, as if they were placing their palms upon a door that would respond only to both. The second and third were to find the measure of the limb that held the blade, the shin's pivot, the hip's memory of an old injury. Yoda felt the pull that had once made him leap readily into assaults lifted from the wrist, dancing in parry and riposte. He did not give it the reins. Age had drawn other maps in him, less quick but more exacting. He kept them. The red blade came like a thrown line in a storm. Sparks jagged azures through the air where contact found contact. The feel of lightning, that which it resembled, and that which he had endured an hour earlier in a room of glass and hypocritical warmth, made his palms ring. The Chancellor laughed, not aloud but in the way a current laughs when it finds the gorge it has been seeking. The man was smaller and less imposing than a myth, but his intention filled him until he seemed to blot the air. Yoda moved. A lean of ankle and knee that seemed a gesture only became a spring that carried his weight to the lip of the central platform. The red blade cut a crescent where he had been. The hum of the sabers filled the chamber's architecture with a sound like the world trying to think. He felt the force pooling around the other, as if it were a great animal being bribed with blood. He knew it would never be bribed that way, but he could not persuade it with words. He would have to show it the other memory, the slow green places. The Chancellor came at him with trained inevitability, the line of his shoulder perfect with years of practice, the set of his feet like the grammar of a language he had taught himself when no one else was watching. The confidence was not feigned. He would have the ending he had prepared his life to have. He was the end. Yoda put himself where endings go to dissolve. He let the force rush through his heels, the way water runs through rootlets. He did not meet the blow. He let the blow meet a lack of path. The crimson arc faltered, finding nothing to anchor the triumph it had expected. And in that instant, Yoda turned his wrists and slid the green blade into the quiet behind the Uter's balance. It was not a strike that would cut. It was the placing of a syllable where a speech had not accounted for silence. The Chancellor stepped back, because he could not understand that he had needed to prevent an absence, and had not. The attack transformed. He became storms, and the chamber took his weather, pods breaking free of their moorings as if massive seeds had been tricked into believing spring had come too violently. They rose and spun. The air was punched into a wind. The Chancellor's laughter arrived like bright broken glass. "Master Yoda," he said, the syllables chorred with contempt. "At the end, you will run again." Yoda felt the pods as bodies whose cores remembered where the seed had been. He touched them not to throw them, not to make them siege engines, but to remind them of their intent, to carry voices. One by one, as they sluiced through the air, he turned them so their interfaces opened to the central floor, as if the Senate were returning to its first posture. Listening, he did not look away from the man. "Run, I will not." The force crackled, and lightning unspooled from the Chancellor's fingers like wire pulled from a spool, with casual strength. Yoda felt the rush of it as weather that had forgotten it had once been cloud, as heat that did not belong to fire. He opened his hands and accepted it. The pain blew open the mouth of the world, and then narrowed it again. His bones drank light. He had learned this in places where life had taught him what it was like to hold a storm and not turn it into a weapon. He grounded it into the floor, into the stone that had been waiting for something worth holding. The Senate chamber remembered words spoken in anger and fear. The smell of cooked dust rose like a forgotten proverb. The Chancellor's face had grown very still. He was measuring. Yoda knew his own pulse had slowed into a count that had nothing to do with blood, but was synchronized with the rise and fall of some larger lung. He did not cast the lightning back, though he could have. He let it run into stone until it recognized that it was not the only story about light. For the first time there was a thin outline of uncertainty around the Chancellor's mouth. The pods, obedient to the Utter's rage, swung free in clusters and came huge and heavy. Yoda moved among them with the measured economy of someone moving through a stand of old trees he had tended. He put a palm upon one as it hammered toward him, and it became slower, not less swift, but less convinced of its own inevitability. He stepped upon another, and let it carry him to a higher tier of the chamber. Green blade a note that stayed true while the storm changed keys. The fight spiraled, and with it, spiraled the story. The man born on Naboo, who wore so many names that he had whittled his own down to hunger, threw the Senate at the old creature from a swamp world people had forgotten to name aloud. Yoda did not hurl the Senate back. He turned it, and in turning it, the chamber became a mouth again, a place meant for speaking. He crossed from pod to pod in the central platform, like a bead, slipping along a thread. The red blade bit, and there were places where his robe smoked, where fur burned and the room filled with the smell of scorched hair and the iron tang of blood. He moved more slowly than he had 15 years ago, and in that slowness, there was precision. He was a gardener thinning a wildness that wanted only its own growth. When the lightning returned, it came without restraint, a sheet that tried to become law. Yoda took it, and this time he did not ground all of it. He held a skein in his palms, the old skin of his hands wrinkling like paper in firelight, and he wove it into something thinner and greener, a filament that hummed. He sent that back, not as pain, but as sound, a pure note of refusal. It struck the Chancellor not in the body, but near the body, and he flinched, not from damage, but because something within him had been asked to remember the first time it had chosen the simpler path, and had called that choice necessity. "You are alone," Yoda said, and did not need to raise his voice. The Chancellor's answer was not words. He dropped his weight through his hips, and came in at a near angle, not quite from behind, seeking to cut along the old master's spine, to make the motion that would end this age of men who believed in patience. Yoda turned half a degree and let the red pass. The green slipped along its length with a hiss like rain along a blade of grass. The Chancellor withdrew with fractions of a second to spare from losing the hand that had become so fluent at signing decrees. It was then that the living force made a small sound like a bell. It did not tell Yoda what to do. It told him where there was a place to stand for a moment that had not yet arrived. He stepped onto a pod that had not yet been thrown and felt its core reverberate with his breath. The Chancellor, misreading the motion, sent the pod carrying into space, but he did not understand that it would go where Yoda's weight had already asked it to. A thrumming went through the chamber. The system, thinking. The emergency broadcast net had been cut in the earlier chaos, and then stitched imperfectly. At the edge of the rotunda, a maintenance droid had waddled out to examine something it could not name. The living force puts its fingers into small accidents. The pod Yoda stood upon turned, its inner mics and screens waking, as if a senator had risen from exhaustion and asked to speak. The chamber, in its confusion, began to listen. Yoda could have called names. He could have made declarations. He did not. He allowed the sound of his breathing to be heard. He allowed the red blade's hungry pitch to be heard. He allowed the broken, regular music of the ships moving through the night outside to be heard. It was, for a span so brief you would have needed a life like his to know it had happened, the Republic hearing itself. The Chancellor saw it. He moved to sever it. His hand, fingers still smoking from the re-education they had received, cut across the console at the pod's lip. Sparks leapt. The listening ceased. "You are astonishingly sentimental," he said, and there was relief in the cruelty. He had feared something in that quiet. "This ends now." Now is a word the hungry are always eager to use. It reassures them that time still belongs to them. They met blade to blade. Yoda parried without haste. The choreography tightened. The pods moved like sleepwalkers, obeying commands spoken in the wrong tongue. They struck stone, bent rails, crashed through seats that would never again seat anyone. The hum took on a hot smell and became grinding. Yoda's shoulders ached where they had once only informed him of the weather. The Chancellor's breath shortened in glee. He had waited long to be allowed to be what he was. They descended, not into the well of defeat that Yoda recognized in himself from the room with glass and lightning. Not that. They descended physically. The fight carried them downward into the substructure where the hives of machinery lived, where ducts breathed in constant sleep, and the ribs of the chamber's skeleton insisted upon themselves in raw metal. Music of fans. Music of the slow pump of whatever fluid ran to cool hearts of generators. Shadows that were carpentered rather than fallen. The space was narrow and innumerable. Pipes close as fingers crowded in the dark. Catwalks skated into dim. The cats of the system, maintenance droids smooth and blind, slid on their rails like beetles. The Chancellor's blade burned these shadows into proclamation. Yoda's lit them without forcing them to become declarations. The difference was not large to sight. It was immeasurable to the Force. "Do you tire?" the Chancellor asked, giving each word the edge of an amused cut. He had shed the warm voice now. He had put on the voice he used for prayers to the thing he believed was himself. "Feel how every step costs you. Feel how we end." "Feel I do," Yoda said. "What I feel, yours is not." The Force did not tell him the future. It told him where cracks were forming in the present. There, a weld that had been done in haste when the Senate had rushed to complete the expansion. There, a seam the air whispered through because the room did not want to be perfectly sealed. He moved his weight along the seam, not because he had a plan, but because life had taught him what was possible, where small disobediences accumulated. The Chancellor followed without thought. He had no need of thought here. His certainty was ballast. He had the rightness of a knife in a sheath. Made for it, at home in it, untroubled by what it meant to be at home. He moved with the speed of a thought that had never considered the possibility of a better one. They came to a platform where the machinery opened like a mezzanine. Below, the deep structure thrummed in vast casements. The floor at the platform's center had a patterned grate. Air pushed through it with a ceaseless patience. Yoda stopped. He caught a breath, and let it be a breath. The Chancellor saw it as a sag in the web, and hurled himself into the gap. The red blade came in a thrust, meant for the heart region of a body much taller than Yoda's. It was the kind of attack that had ended countless things. Yoda was not somewhere else. He was wholly here. He raised the green blade not to block, but to draw the thrust into the angle where metal remembered that it had been welded by a tired hand after too many hours. The grate flexed. The point skated the breadth of a fingernail. It caught. There are echoes, even in quickness of patience. The Chancellor and the blade hung for one eye blink that is as long as a prayer the first time a child says it. Yoda moved the edge of his saber like a skilled cook, who knows how to free a knife without cutting their own hand. The red broke loose. But in that fraction, the Chancellor had to shift his stance, to lighten his weight onto a leg that did not relish being lied to. It was so small the fall of dust would not have recorded it. It was enough. Yoda stepped in. He did not cut. He took the Chancellor's wrist in a pressure that understood exactly how the tendons declared their boundaries. He shut off his blade and used both hands, his body close, and the Chancellor was stronger, but not so strong as a world that had learned to hold a storm. The red saber spun into the dark. The sound of it falling was swallowed at once by the machinery's steady breath. They did not fall after it. The Chancellor's free hand came up, and the lightning was not a figure of speech. It clawed at Yoda's face and found old scars to revisit. The pain made sense. Pain that makes sense has mercy in it. It explains itself. He did not let go. He set his brow against the other's collarbone, smelled the perfume and couch of power, and the metal of machines, and he held the wrist until the hand stuttered, and the lightning's thread wavered, broke, wove again, broke again. Their eyes were very close. In the pupils that were like dark pits in a sandstone face, Yoda saw something that could not be tilted with argument. He did not argue. "See, you are," he said, and the words were a hand set upon a gate that had rusted shut. "What this has made of you, see. Alone you are. Alone. Not necessary is. Then?" The Chancellor's mouth buckled and stayed. He pulled his arm back. The two of them drew breath as if for once they shared a lung. Then the Chancellor smiled. It was a small, patient smile. It was a craftsman's smile. He had never needed the blade. The machinery beneath the grate coughed. Valves turned in the secret. The air thickened with a sweet chemical, whose name had never been spoken in the chamber above. The Chancellor had triggered one of his many prepared contingencies with the weight of his heel. The air folded. Yoda felt his sinuses burn, then numbed. He slid sideways along the platform to where the current was thinner. The red blade climbed out of the dark like a star that had decided to rise under the horizon. The Chancellor did not reach for it. He reached for nothing. He laughed once. Softly, because the joy of a trap sprung is a primitive and various thing. Yoda did not retreat. He stood in the air where the sweet thickening came and let it tell him its story. It was a solvent, an irritant, a friend to unconsciousness. It would not kill him quickly. That was not its task. It would make mistakes in someone's body, and those mistakes would multiply. He altered the shape of his breath. He allowed less of the air into the places where mistakes begin. A lifetime of conversation with mud and cloud and leaf is a useful inheritance. They were at a standoff that had been designed to end quickly, and had not. The Chancellor was surprised, enraged by the surprise that he was still being asked to improvise. Immense as his calculations were, improvisation made him feel the smallness of a man who had never once been content simply to be the person standing next to a friend. He reached with the force, as if his hand were as big as a room, and sought to close it upon the old master and squeeze. Yoda did not rupture. He condensed. He remembered the huts of his homeworld, where one could shrink into a knot against storms, making oneself not a thing to be lifted, but a thing that dug. He breathes in a way that made the body an old stone. He laid the green blade along the seam of the floor, and waited. The clench passed. The Chancellor extended his hands to turn the air into claws. The space around the old master thickened. The sound of the machine below us spoke more loudly. It was not anger but tempo. The red blade returned to a hand as if nights and nights of practice had taught it how to find that hand in the dark. The Chancellor raised it and held the two hands side by side. The pure blood hunger and the intricate tool. His face read something like peace. Yoda opened his eyes. He did not look tranquil. He looked acquainted with the weather. He raised his blade into a guard that had not been taught in any formal school. It resembled an apology for something he had not done, but had not prevented either. The Chancellor did not recognize it. He did not need to recognize it. He came. The duel resumed. The platform quivered. The grate screamed, tiny screams, each time the red blade struck near its welds. Yoda's hands moved like someone smoothing a blanket over a child they love, precise in each corner. The force surged into his legs not as spring but as insistence. When he jumped, it was not acrobatic joy but the exact means of placing oneself where one's weight would speak on one's behalf. The Chancellor's footwork grew more clever as it grew more desperate. He forgot, for a few minutes, to imagine himself as history. He became a body doing its best to win, and in that drop in altitude, there was a certain clarification. They rose along a spine of stairs to a gantry. The air grew cleaner, buoyed by ducts that had not yet been told what they were for. The city's noise returned as a faint geometry in the bones. Yoda felt a far heat, a squeal of metal asked to endure more than it should. The reek of mining gases, Mustafar, like a coal cinder in a lung. The connection was not a line. It was a smell. He did not look that way with his mind. He let the information sit in him until it became mood, sorrow, and an animal readiness. Qui-Gon had once brought him to a similar place. Not with the body. With the kind of nearness that has nothing to do with steps. The conduit between them had been rough then, intermittent. Like the first days of any friendship, where both parties are surprised, they speak the same language. The former master had shown him how to sit in a very small room, with very small things, and allow those things to be large enough. He felt that lesson now the way one feels a hand on the shoulder that had left the room 10 years ago. The gantry was 10 meters above a floor, where enormous cables lay like sleeping snakes. The Chancellor stepped carefully because even certainty knows gravity. He was panting. His teeth showed from time to time when he stopped himself from curling his tongue against them, the way a child does when it concentrates. The green blade made a soft wind. In that place, where the machinery hummed its indifference, where the pods above had stopped swinging, and the Senate had exhausted even the echo of its own talk, Yoda made a choice that had grown in him unnoticed as moss on stone. He did not try to kill the man. He turned the fight into a refusal to obey the grammar the man had spent his life writing. He began to speak. He did not lecture. He did not indict. He said small things, between breaths, between blows. Remember you do, the star over Naboo's river. When young, and before this hunger, watched you did. Small that star was. Big enough it was. Then, the Chancellor snarled, had no words for a moment, because the world that sentence described was impossible. He struck. Yoda parried, and in the parry was an invitation to look, a location where memory might have been stored. Alone, you would be less if a hand you took, Yoda said. And the syntax was so gnarled that it cut through the clean lines of lying. Your order, the Chancellor spat, could not even save itself. Save. We did not deserve. Yoda said softly, and the Chancellor's eyes widened a fraction, not at the content, but at the shape of a sentence that did not fight back where expected. The red blade came anyway. The green slid over it, as if it were water over metal. The force thickened, listening to them both. In its depth, where it is neither light nor dark, where it is only what lives and what dies and the manners by which those two are introduced, the conversation sounded like a brief weather event over a swamp, a hot rain and quiet thunder. Clones reached the vestibule at last. Their boots told Yoda this in their language. Left, right, each a metronome whose arm could swing for days. They did not enter. Orders had allocated the chamber to a drama they were not written to join. They held their perimeter, each man inside his certainty, and the white of their armor turned pink at the edges where red light smoldered. Bail Organa's breath came fast in a corridor whose walls had heard so much law they had become an instrument. He had drawn near enough at one point to see a green flicker against the high curvature of the chamber and a heave of pods. Maz Ameda had stood at his side like a tooth remembering its ache. They had parted without speaking. Each had known the name of the other's soul. It would be said later that the Chancellor had bravely fought off a terrorist. It would be said later that something called order had been preserved. Bale put his hand against the wall, and felt where heat had run like a vein. He closed his eyes for a moment, and understood that history was happening in a form that did not invite witnesses. On the gantry, Yoda changed the angle of his wrists by less than the thickness of a coin. The arc of green altered. It curved a way it had not before, and the red met it, and turned, undid a single thread in its own tapestry, by following a pattern it had assumed was the only pattern. The Chancellor growled. A sound he had never intended to make above a whisper came out of him. He stepped wrong. A fraction. His ankle noticed. Yoda, let the notice exist. See you must, he said, and the words were a pressure upon the form of the room. See this. Ends. This way, everything does. Even you. The Chancellor's response was a move that would have removed the Old Master's head, if the Old Master had not been an infinitesimal shift to the left of where he had been. The red sang down the air. It did not sing against bone. It threw sparks off rail. The smell of cooking paint rose like a memory of childhood fire. The Chancellor brought the blade back around. Blade, wrist, elbow, shoulder, hip, foot, breath, everything. And the move was so perfect that there was nothing to grip inside it. He had made himself the knife again. He would cut forever. Yoda stepped in and put his forehead against the man's sternum, and the two of them stood breathing. They were suddenly very close. The sabers were not what mattered for a moment, and that terrified something in the Chancellor. The part of him that feared being only one thing. He jerked his shoulders back. Yoda did not fall. He stayed, and the staying announced to the room that this too was a form of power. The green blade wrote a small circle near their hips. The red read it, and discovered a character it did not know. The sound was a stutter when they touched again, almost accidental. The gantry's mesh flexed with a sound like thin ice in morning sun. The city, patient and monstrous, watched itself in its windows. The living force moved in Yoda's joints like oil warmed in the sun. He felt the immediate future arrive in a wave that had nothing to do with prophecy, and everything to do with the behavior of heavy things. The gantry would not hold them much longer with the venting valves misbehaving. The fight's end could be collapse. Collapse would not discriminate. It would only end. The Chancellor's eyes had some knowledge of this too. He did not fear falling. He feared endings that were not his handwriting. Yoda did not know how to win. Winning had become a word that elasticized until it fit everything that was not losing. He did not need to win. He needed to hold. Hold is not a stronger word. It is a truer one. He let the force in his arms let go of sharpness. Just enough. He changed the way he held the saber in a manner so delicate it could not have been taught. It had to be grown. The blade's hum altered pitch, the way an animal's sound changes when it recognizes the throat of its friend. He fought not by reducing, but by increasing. Every time the red struck, his answer was bigger, rounder. The circle that does not give way because it gives way everywhere. He began to waste the other's strength by making it necessary for him to be a point against a curve. The Chancellor understood points. He had never understood curves. They were what he had turned the galaxy into, and never felt upon his own skin. He lunged. Yoda turned. The red bit the rail. The green drew a shape in the air that was less a cut than the outline of a doorway. The Chancellor stumbled through that doorway and found that there was no room beyond it, because Yoda had never opened it to him. He tumbled onto a lower span with awkward softness, cat-like and furious, and rose with blood at his lip, where his teeth had finally found something they could puncture. Yoda exhaled. He was not tired or untired. He was in breath. "Look at what this wanting has made of you," he said, and the pity was clean, not condescension. "A jailer, and prisoner also." "Spare me the catechisms," the Chancellor said. But there was raggedness to the contempt now. "You were blind for years. I won while you meditated. Nendatostas." "Won?" Yoda repeated, and the word became a small wind that lifted dust that had lain uncomplaining for decades. "If win this is, glad for such victory, I am not." "We are past gladness," said the Chancellor. He called the red blade to his hand with a sharp gesture that encoded the pleasure of domination, and the Force obeyed because the Force obeys the one who calls until a better call is made. He sprang upward with a bound that betrayed how hard it had become to inhabit the human body without enhancements of will. He was done pretending to be old. He was old and angry about it. They met again. And again. And then, a tremor that was not their doing ran through the structure. A report shuddered up the shaft like a giant had struck the base of the building with a patient hammer. In the moment, both of them widened their attention to perceive this new arrival of fate. Each saw something the other had not wanted seen. The Chancellor saw endurance. Yoda saw fear. It was not fear of loss. It was fear of being asked to stop feeding the thing within that had been fed too long to survive cleanly without it. Then the clones, finally permitted to intrude, arrived on the perimeter of the substructure with orders to sterilize. The corridor lights were not night, but they had the consistency of it. Boots, white armor, the fraternal coordination like a string quartet, who have rehearsed for years and have now decided to play a march. "Stand down," a voice that had learned to love authority in an afternoon shouted, and the sound came from a man whose face had brothers on every world. It was not addressed to Yoda. It was addressed to the world. By order of the Emperor. The traitor is to be terminated. Bendawa. The word arrived with an arithmetic neatness that made bile rise behind Yoda's tongue. Emperor. End. The center had finally spoken its real name. There would be no going back through the door of pretense. This, too, was clarity. The Chancellor did not smile. He let his face remain the strict geometry of someone strong enough to dispense with the theater that had served him so. He looked at Yoda, and for the first time the hunger behind the eyes had a shape like uncertainty. He had wanted this moment observed. He had wanted his victory seen. But victory would be achieved by white masks, repeating a name he had given himself, and something in him resented he would have to share the scene. Yoda took a step that had nothing to do with retreat. He stepped into the place where the air moved least. He turned his blade slightly, the better to make it audible to the clone's ears, not as a threat, but as a tone. "See," he said simply, and the word was not thrown like a command, but placed like a cup of water before a thirsty person. "See what stands before you. Names can lie. Eyes can unlearn." No. The clones were not trained for such sentences. They were trained to shoot. But they were also trained to be men together, and in the togetherness there was always a seam, not of weakness but possibility. The seam is where the stitch goes, the work of gathering. The first shot screamed in the air. It was aimed well, and would have ended an argument with a neatness that politicians admire. Yoda moved his blade and sent the bolt into a panel that showered them all in sparks. Another shot, another refusal. For a few long breaths, they formed a geometry. Red and green at the center. White at the periphery, a welding light knitting a story. The Chancellor lifted his hand. The clone steadied for the heavier fire. "Enough," he said almost kindly. "He is mine." Yoda heard, in the far distance of the Force, a voice that had never learned to stop breaking at the edge of teenage, gasping through a respirator he had put on his own soul. He felt a lava rebellion. He felt a grief that had found a shape it could live in because it had learned to call itself hatred. He let these things exist and did not try to subtract them in his heart, because subtraction is a false arithmetic when you are keeping accounts with the living. He kept them in his chest, and they did not unbalance the blade in his hand. He lowered that blade. He did it slowly enough to be legible, but not ceremonially enough to offer the other the satisfaction of declaring this an oath. The clones hesitated. The Chancellor, attuned to any hesitation that was not reverence, tensed. "Capture him," he said, and the lie in the mercy warmed like rot. Yoda raised his free hand. He did not push. He widened. The force in the corridor loosened, the way a belt loosens after a meal, the way a rigid posture relaxes when a person remembers they do not need to be a statue. The clones' aim drifted by degrees, they did not notice. The Chancellor snatched their focus with a small lash of rage. The aim sharpened like a rebuke. Yoda felt how this could end if he tried to preserve what could not be preserved by cutting it. He felt, too, that leaving would abandon the room to a story that would last for generations if it were permitted to crown itself tonight. "Hold. Dot." He stepped forward and turned the green out with a flick. The hum died. The world seemed larger for a heartbeat, because one of its sounds had stopped, and the others could be heard. The Chancellor blinked. The red blade remained. Hungry and petulant. At last, he murmured, low as satisfaction can be. Yoda breathed once more, and then placed himself on his knees. He set the saber on the floor with 2 fingers, as if it were a fragile instrument. The clones watched, not believing their luck, not trusting it either. Surrender is a word that opens into other rooms if you have spent long enough with it. He had not surrendered to death. He had surrendered the theater. He looked up at the man who had called himself Emperor, and saw that the hunger was not lessened by this gift. It was angered by it. A feast had been promised in blood and defiance. This instead was a bowl of plain rice offered by a peasant at the gate. Some hungers cannot eat what is good for them. They starve, and call it victory. Bind him, the Emperor said, and his voice was now scorched wood breaking in a winter fire. White moved in. Plastic clicked. A cuff, clever, dampened, made by someone who knew how to make a hand forget itself, closed around the wrist that had held green. Yoda did not resist. The clones, efficient and careful, were not cruel, and something like gratitude moved through him that the galaxy still had these small mercies. Competence that was not sadism. The Emperor watched with a mildly bored expression, as if we were witnessing a ritual he had rehearsed so completely that performing it no longer entertained him. I will have your confession, he said. Confession? Yoda said, and the word was a river stone warmed by years of being touched. He did not look at the man as if he were an enemy. He looked as if he were watching rain run down a window. What to confess have I? That you conspired to overthrow the Republic. That you turned the boy against his rightful guardians. That you murdered the young and the loyal. His eyes shone. He was in love with the list. He would name stars if he could, and call their light treason. Words, Yoda said. Thirsty they are. Drink, they will, until empty they become. Still thirsty, they will be. Then sour. The Emperor's smile turned and found its least human categories. You will find, Master Yoda, that thirst is a condition I have learned how to perpetuate. He turned, robe whispering, blade hissing back into sleep. The clones lifted Yoda expertly. He let himself be moved. He felt every bolt, every wash of dim light along the corridor, every scuff and bracket. He learned the infrastructure of the lie, how efficiently it carried bodies from primary chambers to rooms that never had names because they were never meant to be spoken of. He learned the smell of the compound used to clean those rooms, the copper ghost of what happened in them the night someone decided to be thorough. They brought him not up, not down, but sideways into a room of pale walls. There was a chair, widened at the shoulders, and straps that had never read poetry. The clones placed him. The straps did what they were made for. A droid hummed to itself and checked the seal on the cuff with a chirp that meant satisfaction. There was a window in the room, thin and high, like an eyelid. Outside, Coruscant moved on as if nothing had slid into a new orbit. The Emperor waited until the clones had left. 2 remained, faceless at the door, and then approached again with a careful slowness. He wanted the old creature to see each inch of his nearness as a gift. You were wrong to return, he said, and there was no heat in it. He was not counseling, only recording. You could have lived long enough to witness the peace I am bringing. Yoda closed his eyes and opened them. He inhabited the breath as if it were a building, exploring each room. Peace, he said. Named that, you will call the quiet of graves. History will name it differently, the Emperor said. History is a current I have directed for many years. Yoda turned his head a fraction and let his eyes find the window. He held the sight of the moving lane sorrowfully, and with a fondness he would have only for something that had disappointed him, and still deserved not to be abandoned. History, he said, is not a river only. A swamp it is sometimes. Full of life. Slow. True. Turn it quickly you can. But to keep it, you must feed it, and hungry always it becomes. Mensa. The Emperor's hand twitched, perhaps at the thought of swamps. He had never liked places that did not yield their geometry immediately. I will feed it. Yourself. And everyone else. From the corridor, a murmur, like a shout 80 meters away. Then the whisper of comms, the nervous discipline of men talking themselves into acting perfectly. The Emperor turned his head and listened for a few seconds, then nodded once. "It seems," he said almost idly, "we have a visit to pay to your temple's ruins. There are loose ends." Ought. The young, the ones whose breath had been still warm in the stone when Yoda had felt it, and had known something he had not allowed himself to name had happened. His body did not jerk against the straps. He did not let his knowledge make theater. He let the pain place a hand on his sternum and press. He let the pressure propagate to where memory would store it without rotting. He sent his breath along the hallways of his lungs to a place where it could climb out through a skylight and look at the sky. He found, out there, over a lava river, a boy kneeling alone in smoke that acted like prayer. He did not say the boy's name. Names do a work of fixing, and the boy had been fixed enough for one lifetime. He only sat near him in the way a presence can sit near when the body has been tied to a chair in a room whose walls have the color of a bad morning. "Qui-Gon," he said without moving his lips. The answer was not a message, not a doctrine. It was a warmth across the shoulders. It did not give him a plot. It gave him consent to be very small, and being small, to be very difficult to move. He opened his eyes and found the Emperor studying him, with a fascination that had finally replaced boredom. "You are talking to someone," the Emperor said. "It is written in the way your eyes stand." "Talking," Yoda agreed. "Listening, more." "To whom?" "To what you forgot." It irritated the man in a way Yoda could not have improved upon if he had tried. The Emperor smoothed his robe the way one soothes a dog, not with kindness, but because its coat sits wrong. "We will continue this conversation later," he said. He turned to a clone officer and gave a sequence of instructions whose syllables were polished by habit. "Do not kill him," he said at last, and the sweetness in the mercy was a tocsin. "He is useful." They left. The door hummed itself shut with the intimacy of a mouth that has learned your name to better swallow it. 2 clones remained. One shifted his weight because the armor bit at a place at the hip where it had always bit. The other ran a thumb along the seam of his blaster, and thought of the rambutan he had once eaten on a world where there had been trees, how the fruit had been strange, and his brothers had laughed to see the hair around it, and then had eaten it with a greed that had felt like generosity. Neither moved their helmets. Yoda breathed. The room breathed slowly and badly, as if it had lungs but had never practiced. He placed his breath inside the room's breath, and taught it a little of rhythm. He went to the place inside where the cuffs held his wrists and felt the story embedded in the metal. The part where necessity had justified itself. The part where fear had asked to be held and had been held too tightly. He did not despise the cuff. He let the cuff feel his regard. It did not soften, but it changed color by a shade that no human eye could detect. If he was to die here, he would die with the form of the story altered by a degree only the Force could measure, and only the future could register. If he was to live, it would be because he had made no effort to be clever, only to be exact. He did not sleep. He went into the place where a person rests without relinquishing their wakefulness, the way a fisherman on a night lake listens, and the way the lake listens back. He visited the temple and the walls that had heard laughter and incantation and adolescent nonsense, the silly and sacred mixed in the way that had once made the place safe. He went to the library and placed his palm on the spine of a book that had never not been surprising. He went to the room where the smallest slept and gently replaced a blanket in a memories version of the room that did not include the scorched marks where a blaster bolt had selected a wall and then a body. He did not remove those marks. He would not decorate the truth. He held both versions until they were not at war inside him. Outside, Coruscant turned and did not stop turning. There was a new advertisement 3 levels down from the window. A face promising a bolder tomorrow if you bought the right thing today. Traffic made the light look like rain pasted to the air. Far off, a ship arrowed away from the planet with a speed that was also grief. On that ship sat a man whose mustache collected the sweat of someone who had been afraid, but had refused to stay afraid forever. He would not recall later what he had felt as he looked once toward the Senate dome. Only that he had felt it. In the dawn that is not light, but the hour when shift rotations change and machines with consciousness, the size of insects, start to hum with different numbers. The door hissed again. A figure entered who was made from posture. Masameda, horns a stone crown. He stood with the relaxation of a man whose job is to translate cruelty into procedure. Master Yoda, he said, and his voice had learned to pronounce titles without letting honor leak in. Your statements are required. Yoda looked at him and remembered him holding ceremonial staffs with a reverence that had been honest once, before the staff had become a baton. Required? He said, as if tasting the syllables. Your order, Masameda said. And it was not a mispronunciation. He claimed that now for someone else, has done great damage. You will participate in healing. We will begin by clarifying your role in the sedition. And no. Yoda tilted his head. He gazed at the window. He looked back. Clarifying, he said, and the word lit in his mouth like a candle in an old room. Good word, that is. Clarify, I will. He did not. He sat. He watched the man. He let silence thicken like sap. He said small things, when he said anything. Names of planets no one listed anymore. A proverb in a language Masameda had not known Yoda could speak. A question about the weight of the staff. He led the other not into confession, but into listening, which is a skill more dangerous to a tyrant than any weapon. Between such sessions he was alone. The clones shifted. Once, one of them, one whose gait had a tiny hitch where a childhood injury nothing like childhood had left its document, dropped a tool and cursed under his breath, and looked at Yoda as if a man in a painting had finally moved, and had frowned with him in sympathy. The moment wasn't repeated. It was enough. Hours layered. The Emperor came. He did not come with knives. He came with stories. He spoke of stability. He spoke of the end of corruption. He spoke of the destiny of great civilizations, as if he were asking a child to let go of his hand and cross a river alone, to prove that the child had courage. He asked questions not to gather answers, but to spread nets. Yoda let the nets land upon him like cobwebs, delicate and stupid, and then blinked them away with the patience of an animal that likes where it sleeps. He did not give the confession. He gave once, one sentence with the firm softness of bread, placed on a table for anyone present to share. Forgive yourself, you cannot, he said. So the galaxy he will destroy, to make its silence say the word for you. The Emperor did not strike him. He did not threaten him. He only breathed in a way that made the skins of everyone in the room itch. Then he left, because leaving the room was a kind of victory too. Word carried. Word always carries somehow even when every channel has been soldered shut. Across Coruscant, whispers braided themselves into rumors, into quiet affirmations, spoken when windows were being cleaned, when noodles were ladled into bowls, when a child was picked up and set down. They did not say the name Yoda. They said a sentence that thousands had tried to mean across millennia, that a person had chosen not to win, and the choosing had made something possible the person who had won could not imagine. In a hangar far away, a ship waited that had been scrounged from repair bays and favors. In its hold sat quiet crates. Inside one was not a crate. Inside one, the air smelled like a swamp that loved its own darkness. There was a plan. There were 5 plans, 10. All flawed. All necessary. None of them were called running away in the hearts of those who made them. They were called keeping a small light out of the wind, which was never more than luck, and never less than faith. In the night that is only a lighter shade of day on Coruscant, because the planet had abolished night centuries ago by forgetting it, Yoda waited and did not count minutes. He did not attend to the number of breaths he had left. He did not keep a ledger of could-haves. He watched the city move like an animal that had outgrown its own bones, and was now learning again how to walk. He practiced holding without hardening. He practiced letting go without dropping. He practiced the only art that matters when the world agrees to starve, the art of remembering enough goodness to make it worth the labor of keeping. The door opened again. Not day, not night. The hour when even tyrants are briefly susceptible to their own doubts. The clones stood straighter. A figure entered, wrapped in a cloak that deferred attention, and was nonetheless perfectly cut. Bail Organa had learned how not to be noticed by cultivating the grace of the noticed. He nodded once to the clones. He had a clearance. He had a signature. He had the correct lies. He had told himself none of them were lies, not out of self-deception, but because lie was too small a word for the work of prying a door open with your bare fingers while the house burns. He stood before the chair. He waited until the clones had stepped back to the distance specified. He did not smile. "Master," he said, as if the word were both respectful and practical to use in a conversation that had to carry more than it could carry. Yoda looked at him for a long time until the senator understood he was being asked if he truly wanted what he said he did. He nodded once. "Time," Bail said, and the syllable had the wear of something used often and carefully. "Very little time." Yoda lowered his eyes at the straps. Bail's hands worked without show. The cuff was a complexity designed to laugh at those who wanted to free hands with fingers alone. Bail used a tool he had acquired by telling a truth to the wrong person at the right moment. The cuff sighed. The straps unbuckled with the sound of old habits being interrupted. The clones did not move. They had been told to mind different doors. "Go," Bail whispered. "Go." Yoda tasted the word as he had all the others. Not mockery. Inquiry. Bail's mouth tugged, not toward a smile but toward the contortion a man makes when he lifts something heavier than he wants to admit it is. "Please." Yoda stood. The room swayed like a ship for a heartbeat. He put one hand on the senator's forearm and then took it away, lest the gesture feed a kind of hunger in the moment that he did not want to feed. He went toward the door. The clones looked away with a carefulness so severe it was reverence. They moved through the corridor not quickly, but right. The correct doors opened, and the incorrect ones forgot to ask questions. The air smelled like industrial lemons and complication. At one juncture, a human voice behind a desk began a sentence, and then stopped because another voice, older and nearer to power, had begun a different sentence and decided to end the first one. Their feet placed a rhythm on the floor that would not be recorded by any instrument other than the heart. A maintenance shaft. Open. Ladders like vertebrae. Yoda climbed more gracefully than anyone had a right to expect. Bail followed, aware that the edges of the rungs liked to bite palms that had not learned the calluses of labor. At the base, a door that had not been meant to be an exit was an exit. Ships breathe. A hangar breath is unmistakable. Oil, cold, longing. There was no one. There was everyone. The noise of it was the sound of leaving. Precise, blunt, convinced. A compact craft waited with a mouth open. Inside, a compartment whose tracking had been insured by a paperwork error that had taken a very young civil servant 3 hours to correct, and then had been corrected again by an older civil servant who had made the error on purpose, because sometimes a life consists of nothing but knowing which errors to repeat. They entered. The door closed. The ship did not leap. It behaved. It made all the bureaucratic motions a ship makes when it wants to be mistaken for something ordinary. At the lip of the bay, a voice in a booth asked a question in a bored tone. Another voice, deeper and bought long ago, answered. Lights changed from red to amber to green. The craft slipped into the lanes. Outside, Coruscant went about its business like a mind that has decided not to think the thought that will change everything. The Senate dome lay still, not collapsed. The pods lodged in absurd positions against the curve. The dignified ruin of an argument that had run too long. At its center, a figure stood for a moment in a pool of dark and considered the difference between ending a life and ending a story. He did not savoir the difference. He only knew that the life had slipped for now, and the story would need revising. He had always been a superb editor of other people's endings. On a course drawn to graze the night, the ship climbed until the air surrendered its blue. Yoda sat without speaking. Bail kept his hands on the sticks with an attention that was not fear, but the adult cousin of fear. Care. The displays painted the inside of the small cockpit, with colors meant to comfort pilots into believing they were safe. They were not safe. They were alive. Where? Baal asked at last, when asking was safe. Yoda watched the city until it became a shape, and then a feeling and then a weight inside him that did not press, only ensured the bones stayed in their place. Away, he said. Then, after a few breaths that acknowledged his earlier vow in the chamber by not betraying it, not run. Fight we will. Quiet fighting, perhaps. Long? He closed his eyes and opened them. First, the living to gather. Then, the truth to grow like moss. Baal nodded once. He had always loved moss. He did not know this about himself. He knew now. There are others, he said. Not many. Enough to begin. Oh. Beginnings, Yoda said, and the word was not an anthem, but a chore made holy. Many. They rose to where stars were cold embroidery. He felt, to his right and down, a fire on a planet that rented heat to grief cheaply. He felt, to his left and up, a woman with fierceness braided into her, as if her hair itself had learned to be a promise. He felt the force like an animal that has been frightened and is beginning to listen for a calm voice that does not promise more fear. He felt, like the smallest of seeds in his palm, the possibility that mercy was not dead, only tired. He thought of the chamber where he had knelt, and of the fact that he had not taught the galaxy that victory always arrives wearing a sword. He knew this would not be understood quickly. But Moss had time. Old I am, he said, as if informing the ship. Slow, I will be. We have time, Baal said, lying beautifully. Yoda smiled the smile of a creature who knows the difference between the beauty of a lie and the beauty of a truth, and forgives the lie because it is carrying the truth on its back, like a friend. He let himself sleep then, a sleep that was not surrender, but investment. In his rest, he sat again on the floor of the Senate, and breathed while someone not a person, not a god, listened. In that listening there was a vow that no longer belonged to a single order, but to any living thing that could hear water. The vow was simple and exacting, and never ends. When he woke, the ship was in the soft dark between Coruscant and stars. The city looked like an old scar. It did not ache then. It would. He arranged his robe on his legs as if making a bed for a child who had been sick and was recovering. He placed his hands upon his knees, and for a long time, did nothing but attend to the comings and goings of breath, and the ways breath consented to come and go. The galaxy had tilted. He would not tilt with it in the way the Emperor had written. No, but he would dig in. He would become small and wide and everywhere, if necessary. Patient water. He would do it because someone had to teach the swamp how to swallow fires without forgetting its trees. And in a chamber that would be cleaned until it gleamed, the Emperor stood alone, the red blade sheathed, the hunger vibrant. He did not rage. He did not pronounce. He turned his face to where, on a far line, heat and black rock conversed, and he whispered a name as if the name could turn back into a boy if said correctly. He said the name as if it were his to say. The name did not answer. Something else did. A sound like a machine being asked to be a body, deep, enormous, permanent as iron. He smiled. The city brightened a fraction because a new advertisement had been installed. The ship that carried the old master did not register the change. It moved through the night like a thought that had decided to wait before it tried again to change the mind, thinking it. It moved like a prayer no one would hear in public for a long while. It moved like moss. Oh, Kai. The ship's window bit a thin crescent into the darkness, and kept it, a small mouth holding each new breath of stars. Baal watched the gauges as if they were young animals prone to spook, one palm steady on the stick, the other resting on the toggle no one ever had to use until the 1 hour when they did. The corvette murmured and did not boast. It did not believe in speed as an argument, only as a gift. Yoda sat with his eyes half-lidded and open wider than they had ever been, the way a creature listens from inside its sleep. Outside the hull, the galaxy rearranged itself without asking permission. He felt the shape of the rearrangement, the way a gardener feels the first frost, long before it arrives, by the way leaves change their sound when moved by wind. A heat bled through the force from a place where rock argued with fire, and neither would yield. A name that was not a name yet, Because a name makes a door. Knelt on a black shore and learned to breathe like a machine. He did not look, not with the gaze that can turn sorrow into surveillance. He let the knowing pass through him like weather. Closer, much closer, he felt a light that was not one light but two. A pulse that touched the pulse in his wrists with a rhythm more exact than any metronome. The light receded and then flashed, not with fear but with the announcement of arrival. Baal glanced sideways and met him at the border of a question. "We're clear of Coruscant's shadow," he said, the relief in his voice practical, neither triumphant nor afraid. "There's a rendezvous, an old mining installation in the Polis Massa field. It's quiet." "Quiet," Yoda said, and the word was a tool he turned in his palm. "Good." The asteroids came into view like thoughts that had decided to become stone. The base had the look of something built with politeness toward geology. It leaned its corridors into the rock's natural obedience rather than forcing an argument. They slid into a dock whose doors closed with the careful finality of an eyelid. The difference between captivity and sanctuary is sometimes only the trust of the one inside. Medical light is different from all other light. It pretends to be impartial. It is not. It leans always toward the living. The first corridor smelled of cleansers that wanted to be as harmless as water, and were not. The second smelled of oil. The third of metal warmed by the work of small motors and by breath. They moved through them without drama. Baal's clearance the key that did not jingle, only work. The med center opened like a white flower to swallow them. Droids with gentle arms arranged instrument trolleys while thinking in their way, about levels of charge rather than ethics. A woman in a matte gown walked past with a sleeve stained in the color that means there is still time. A small being with too many eyes watched from a wall niche as if it were a shrine. And there, bent over a bed whose rails were too clean for any myth, stood Obi-Wan Kenobi, shoulders thrown back because the body remembers stances when it has forgotten sleep. He turned, and the lines around his eyes were a geography. His beard was irregular where a blade had sought to tidy in the dark, while the ship shook. He did not speak. He did not need to. He saw Yoda, and understood that the world had bent but not broken at its hinge. "Master," he said at last, and the syllable held relief and bewilderment like two stones in one hand. Yoda came to the bed. He looked down at Padme Amidala, who had turned her face a fraction toward a ceiling that offered her no answers and no lies. Her breath was thin, as if it were a difficult instrument she had never had to practice. The med droids hovered with the patience of those who believe in the arithmetic of fluids and the grammar of electrical impulses and are not wrong, only incomplete. "She is dying," a droid said in the voice of a polite ocean. "We can maintain. We cannot arrest the underlying cascade." "Cascade," Baal murmured, as if the word were water he had once seen fall from a cliff on Alderaan and scatter into rain that felt like kindness on his cheeks. Padme's eyes opened. She saw the small green figure and the tall, tired knight, and the senator who had not slept, and she smiled the way a person smiles when a memory from a better day enters the room unannounced and sits down without explanations. "We thought," she said, and the words had to choose a path around a pain that did not want to be polite. "We thought we could prevent a fire with love." "Sometimes," Yoda said, and his voice was slow as a swamp, "love prevents nothing. But after, stay it does. Hold it will." Her lips curved again. She turned her gaze to Obi-Wan, and her eyes found in him the honest guilt of a man who has done everything he could do and cannot accept that it was everything. "He was already falling," she whispered. "I thought my hand would be a rope." "Ropes burn," Obi-Wan said quietly, and the admission was a wound finally spoken aloud. "Eh." Yoda lifted a palm a fraction, and the words did not need to finish dying in the air. "Blame," he said. "Heavy it is. Carrying, we must not. Work, we must do. Then, the babies," Padme said, and the word shocked the room into a different moral temperature, as if someone had opened a window that had not existed a moment earlier, and the air had changed its mind about what it wanted to be. "They must live." "They will," Baal said before anyone could correct him with caution. They will. The medroids did what they had been made to do. The room prepared itself for arrival, the way a field makes itself ready in spring with no belief in harvests and all belief in seeds. Yoda stood slightly to one side and let the force thicken where he placed his attention, not as a demand but as soil. Obi-Wan washed his hands the way a man prepares for prayer when he is not certain he believes in the God but believes in the preparation. Padme held on and let go. Both. The two arts life teaches and death examines. It is not a battle. It is not a negotiation. It is a door, and two people walk through. Luke came first, red-faced and outraged by the idea of air. Then Leia, quieter, as if the first sound she had chosen to make were listening. There were no trumpets. There were only the tiny sufficiencies. A cry, a suckling, the counting of fingers by someone who has learned that numbers are sometimes the only way to honor awe. Yoda looked at them and did not rush to place prophecy upon their heads, as if prophecy were a crown. He let them be small, because smallness is a power tyrants never learn to understand, and thus cannot corrupt. Padme held them, one and then the other, and in her eyes, a peace settled that had not visited since the war had learned her address. There is good in him, she said, and the words were not plea or defense anymore. They were the kind of truth that does not ask to be believed, only to be kept where it will be needed. I know. Yoda nodded once, gravely, because acquiescence offered too quickly cheapens solemn things. Know this I do, he said. And still, the work before us remains. She exhaled. It was a breath like a ribbon that has been cut by a clean blade and then laid down. Her fingers loosened. The droids made the small motions that mean doing all there is to do. The room heard a silence that is not emptiness, but the end of one song and the beginning of another for which there are not yet words. Obi-Wan stood very still and let the absence write itself on him. He did not fight it. He had learned too much about fighting. Bail bowed his head in the way of a man accustomed to devotions he does not show in public. Yoda closed his eyes and listened to the Force adjust its weight to accommodate one more soul, as a tree shifts minutely when a bird settles on a branch. There was no argument about what must be done. There were only the terms of it, worn at the edges from being turned over in minds not yet brave enough to admit they had already chosen. Separate them, Yoda said, and he did not dress the sentence in tragedy. Tragedy had had enough clothing. Hidden, each must be. Watched, each must be. Taught one day, Bail looked up as if called by name. My wife and I, we have long wished. He began again because wishes are embarrassed of themselves. There is space in our home for a child, he said in the language of a senator asking for a measured favor, and a husband asking for a miracle. A daughter. We can protect her. We can call her ours. Yoda saw the house on Alderaan before Bail described it. The stone warmed each morning by the same angle of sun. The balcony where wind learned what kindness was from mountain air. The table where arguments were permitted to end without victory as a condition of love. He saw a girl running in a corridor, and the corridor adjusting itself to fit her joy. He nodded once. Leia. Obi-Wan's eyes had turned toward a far horizon that was not on any map. Awen and Beru on Tatooine, he said. They're stubborn in the way that grows roots. They're not unkind. They would not run. He did not say the name of the boy because saying names conjures expectations, and expectations weigh down babies like chain. He would be safe. Not happy, but safe enough, and love, if sternly given, is still love. Safe, Yoda said, tasting the word again. Enough. For now. And you? Obi-Wan asked, and the question had been loitering since the first moment in the Corvette. When Bail had glanced at the small figure and wondered where the galaxy would permit him to stand. Hide. I must, Yoda said, and the admission was not retreat, only geometry. Quiet place, deep. Train, I will. Learn, I must. What the living Force offers me still to learn. Qui-Gon. Speak with him, I can. Teach me, He will. To become greater smallness. Obi-Wan lowered his head. I should stay with the boy on Tatooine. Watch from a distance. When the time comes, if it comes, I will be there. When it comes, Yoda said gently, inserting the word that plants resist when they have been beaten by hail, but hold anyway. There were logistics. There are always logistics. An Alderaanian courier outfitted discreetly for family travel would depart within the hour. A crew who did not know they were brave would be asked to do their jobs perfectly, which is often the bravest act. A small freight runner with a registry that did not look dangerous, because nothing about it looked important, would leave the next day toward a planet no one visited because it did not look like the kind of place where anything significant could happen. Obi-Wan would take a detour through a ship whose chair looked like a throne until a baby had sat in it and turned it into a cradle, and then he would vanish into sand. The med center gave them a room with the dignity of a chapel and no ornaments. They took their farewells there without eulogy. Bail touched Padmé's hand where the nails had kept their gloss out of sheer defiance of grief and politics. Obi-Wan bowed until his forehead nearly touched the bedrail. Yoda stood with his palm upon the sheet in the old way of those who need to tell the world they are still willing to touch it, even when it hurts. The droids drew the curtain back into place with the humility of machines who know they will be accused of coldness, even when they are only doing their task. Come, Yoda said at last. Work. They made bundles of what could not be left behind, and looked at what could be left behind, and allowed themselves to be surprised by how much it was. Bail sent messages that looked like personal notes about renovations to a summer home, and actually were coordinates for future days when words would be dangerous and silence would be a rope across a ravine. Obi-Wan found a cloak that did not belong to him and made it belong to him. Yoda sat for 10 minutes and changed nothing, and that was the most important act anyone performed in that hour. He showed Obi-Wan how to sit a different way in those 10 minutes, how to place the ankles and the breath so that the small space behind the sternum would not buckle at the first sign of grief, pretending to be duty. He spoke softly about the trick of not hooking one's attention onto the hook thrown by fear. He said Qui-Gon's name in a way that was also a door. The path, he said, is narrow and wide. Narrow for the self, wide for the Force. With you, I am. Though not with you, I will be. Obi-Wan's smile came from very far away and landed as lightly as a moth. I will listen, he said. You know how stubbornly I sometimes listen. No, I do, Yoda said, and the gentleness in it was a threshold the other could step over without stumbling. Bail returned with a woman whose face had the willed stillness of someone who had practiced not showing joy until it could be used without punishment. Breha Organa stood beside him, and the room rearranged itself around the axis of her attentiveness, without complaint. She took the child in her arms with the calm of a queen and the vulnerability of a mother, and somehow made both acts the same. She looked at Yoda and bowed the perfect degree. Looked at Obi-Wan and saw in him the shore of a sea that could not be crossed yet would have to be. Looked at her husband and found him in the middle of being both brave and afraid, and loved him there. Leia, she said, and the name did the work of a blessing without the vanity of it. In another room, a nurse placed a finger in the tiny fist of the boy, who would be taken to a world of 2 sons, and said quietly to the Force, without theology, that she would like him to never know the sound of certain kinds of boots. The Force listened and did not promise. It never promises. It receives. Bail's corvette left like a table grace spoken in a whisper and not for show. Yoda watched it go on a monitor that did not deserve to carry such weight and refused to break under it anyway. He put his hand on the casing, and for a moment, the ship felt it. A tremble crossed the console that could be explained by vibration and could also be explained by love, and neither explanation was incorrect. Obi-Wan departed in a craft that had hauled ore and sadness and meals for men who did not believe in holidays, and would soon be hauling hope disguised as weariness. Before he climbed the ramp he stopped and looked back, and saw the small figure standing as if the floor had made itself to his measure. They did not speak. They had said the necessary things. Obi-Wan raised 2 fingers in a gesture too tiny to be a salute, and exactly the right size to be a vow. Yoda raised 2 fingers in answer, and the vow completed itself as a circle. He did not linger. He did not make a tour of the base and bring meaning to doors by opening them. He found a quiet chamber, dark at its edges where the rock insisted upon being rock, and sat. He did not close his eyes. He let the darkness accumulate until it was a friend. Qui-Gon came on no wind. The old rebellious warmth settled on his shoulders again, lighter this time, more like trust and less like urgency. Yoda did not speak at once. He allowed the presence to become a room, and then he placed himself in it. "Stubborn you are," he said at last. "And you are kinder than you think," Qui-Gon answered, amused affection varnishing the sentence until it gleamed. His voice did not echo. It existed like breath inside a lung. "You are learning to hold a storm without becoming it." "Storm," Yoda said. "Many. One I could not end." "You refuse to let it choose the story," Qui-Gon said, and the pride inside the words was not the pride of a master keeping score. It was of a friend recognizing courage when courage tries to hide inside humility. "It matters. Not in ways anyone will write down tonight. But the Force. It keeps ledgers in moss, and in the way children learn to laugh." "Then." Yoda exhaled a sound that was not a laugh, and was not one. "Teach me," he said, and the asking, so simple, was the hardest thing he had ever done. "What next?" "You know already," Qui-Gon said. "But I will sit with you while you know it if you like. That is what we never permitted ourselves before, is it? To have company in knowing." They sat. They said very little. And in that room without windows, the old master became a student again, and learned how to leave footprints in a swamp, without leaving footprints at all. On Coruscant, the Emperor crossed polished floors with the posture of a man in love with the sound of his own robes. He had arrived from a world where the mountains make murder look natural and had acquired, on the journey home, a new instrument that breathed like a man and made men forget that breathing like a man is not the same as being alive. He stood for a time and admired the silhouette. Then he turned and began to give orders, simple ones with complicated consequences. He did not need to be dramatic. Everyone else would add drama as interest. Maz Amedda brought him reports as if they were delicacies, and he the palace hound sniffing at plates to select which to devour whole, and which to toy with. "The Senate," he said, as if the word were an illness that had survived an attempted cure. "A session. Tomorrow," the Emperor said. "We will allow them to applaud." "And the prisoner?" Maz Amedda stopped, because he remembered the prisoner was no longer where the prisoner was meant to be, and the sentence could be either a question or an admission of failure. The Emperor spared him the choice by smiling. "I will allow the rumor of his capture to persist," he said. "It pleases me." He lifted a hand. "It pleases our purposes. A shadow is as useful as a corpse. More useful, perhaps. It moves when called upon." Maz Amedda bowed, because politics is the art of bowing in the right direction at the right time. He wondered where the shadow would move, and whether it would refuse to. On Polis Massa, a small room breathed. Yoda stood and stretched like a creature remembering it has a spine. He collected what little he had brought. A cloak that smelled of smoke and of the oil used to care for lightsabers, which is a smell that persuades the hands to steady. A pouch of herbs not for spellcraft but for tea. A piece of netting woven by a child in a village no one could find on a map now because the map had been redrawn to omit unprofitable places. He walked to the dock and stepped onto a vessel whose name had peeled off long ago, and would not be repainted. He sat in a chair bolted to a floor that had known too many loads. The pilot was a woman with lines at the corners of her mouth that had been cut there by years spent smiling at people who did not deserve the generosity. She nodded to him as if he were a package that had to be delivered with care, and did not ask where he wanted to go. He told her anyway. "Ace, I know," he said. "Dagobah dot. Swamp world. Quiet it is. Loud it is. Full it is. Empty it is. Then der wire." She raised an eyebrow because many men had told her to go to many places that had turned out not to exist, and this sounded like most of them. But there was a quality in the last word that made her hand find the coordinates on the old panel without complaint. The steadiness of someone speaking not of fantasy but of home. They rose without ceremony. Asteroids slid past like old animals who had learned to share a waterhole. The stars arranged themselves into the modest mathematical displays astrogation requires, and then into silence. Yoda sat with his hands where he could see them, because it is good to be reminded, from time to time, that you are not a mind alone. The pilot stole glances. She had known Jedi and not known them. The way citizens know planets they will never walk upon by seeing them on charts. She had expected light, trickery, battles recovered in stories that improved both defeats and victories. The small figure was simply small. The robe bunched at the knees. The ears had learned to listen, and looked as if they were listening now. The eyes were not tired. Tired is an indulgence those with no work left to do indulge in. The eyes were working. "Dagobah," she said at last, not to break any silence but because words like to breathe. Sounds. Wet. Wet, Yoda said, and the smile was the kind a forest makes when the first rain remembers it after a long season. Good, that is. On the other side of the sky, Obi-Wan learned how to sleep in sittings of 10 minutes, and learned how to wake with his hand exactly where it had to be to catch a falling something before it fell far enough to be a problem. He made friends with a ration bar, and pretended it was food until by the 9th bite it had become food. He stood with the boy in his arms, and looked at a line of sand so straight it seemed a child had drawn it with a ruler, and asked the Force to forgive him for bringing innocence to a place where innocence would always feel like a foreigner. On Alderaan, Breha lifted the girl, and the room understood what it meant to be held by someone who had trained their arms for decades for this act. The staff moved with the gentleness of people who knew they were inside a secret so large it could not be shaped by any one mouth into a story, and that the only way to honor it was to place each foot down quietly, where it must go. Bail laughed once in a corridor without meaning to and startled himself with the sound. A mountain wind entered the palace, and was shown the nursery, and was permitted to leave by the same window through which it had entered, because in that house even winds were trusted. On Coruscant, the first statues were designed with care. The sculptors received their commissions and believed themselves fortunate because they were allowed to make large things that would be looked at by multitudes. The faces they carved were approved. The language attached to them was approved. The budget was approved. They did not know that opinions regarding stone last longer than opinions regarding laws. Yoda's ship crossed a quiet space where comets might once have been children dreaming. He slept without abandoning wakefulness, because sleep is not surrender when taken correctly. It is a tool. Qui-Gon spoke to him in the grammar of people who have chosen to stay a little while longer than they otherwise might have, and thus have earned the right to be imprecise. The pilot adjusted trim because something in the far left thruster liked to do a thing that made a sound that frightened people who had not heard it before. She had, and so she smiled. Dagobah unfolded not like a map, but like a memory resurfacing with the gentleness of moss. The world did not announce itself. It breathed. The ship dropped into atmosphere, and found that the air had a taste like old stories told, without enemies in them. Clouds went by and were not decorations, only laborers at their tasks. Water lay down wherever land did not lift itself with sufficient conviction. Trees discovered how to be forever without bragging. Insects practiced insistence. The land did not pretend to be safe. It was not unsafe either. It did not understand those words. They found a clearing by consensus. The ship asked the land. The land, uninterested in asking back, allowed. The ramp lowered, and Yoda stepped into a humidity that stroked his fur with fingers, the temperature of breath. He closed his eyes and allowed smell to ride upon him. Rot that was not decay but feasting. Blossom that did not announce itself, but was there for anyone who wanted to notice. Mud thinking its long thoughts. The pilot came to the lip of the ramp, made a face because city people make faces when asked to love honest smells, and then stopped, arrested by the peace that does not seek applause. "You will be all right?" she asked, which was a kindness, and not an attempt to absolve herself. "Right," Yoda said. "Not the word. Here, I will be. That is enough." She nodded. The way one nods to a truth one does not understand but respects, because someone worthy of respect has spoken it. She lifted her hand in a farewell, and withdrew like a person leaving a temple, and needing to place each foot carefully to prove to the room she had learned the lesson it had offered. He watched the ship rise and vanish behind a lazy veil of fog. He waited until the fog restitched itself. He listened. In the listening, there were many lives and no stories yet. That was good. He walked without making decisions about where to walk, and the swamp showed him the place where a hut could be not a wound, but a graft. He did not summon wood with the force, as if the force were a workforce. He picked up what the land offered. A rib of a tree already freed from its governance by fungi. A mat of reeds that had woven itself into something like a blanket. A stone that had been polished by something crawling, and would now be a table. He built slowly, the way a conversation is built between kind strangers, when each is wary of speaking too loudly. At night, the eyes of small predators watched him the way senators watch an uninvited speaker. Interested, alert for opportunities to discredit. He greeted them without agenda. They learned his scent and his quiet, and decided, because life always decides one way or another, that he was furniture. He ate well enough. He slept well enough. He woke before dawn in the hour where swamps remember the stars, and he placed his hands upon the ground, and told the ground he was sorry to be a person, and that he would try, nevertheless, to be the kind the ground could trust. The ground did not answer. It permitted him to kneel, and that was answer enough. Qui-Gon's visits grew less like interruptions, and more like old men playing sabacc in a back room. No one would think to search, saying very little, and enjoying the saying very much. They practiced a trick that had nothing to do with immortality, and everything to do with courtesy. How to be present after the body stops insisting upon presence. Yoda learned to thin himself like smoke without ceasing to be fire. He learned how to be small, not only by stature, but by choice. He learned the kind of patience that is not waiting, but standing witness long enough for witness to become work. Sometimes the swamp told him things. It told him when a nest had been robbed by hunger, and when hunger had been robbed by abundance. It told him where a vine had learned, by mere persistence, how to lift a rock no hand could have moved. It told him, in its way, that the lesson of smallness is not to make oneself less, but to recognize that the world is very large and full of lives, and that the self is only one among them, and thus free. On Coruscant, the Senate clapped, just as the Emperor had predicted. They were good at clapping. They had practiced for years while calling it debate. The sound filled the dome like rain that has forgotten to be clean. Masameda stood with the staff and felt nothing, and called it triumph. Holofeeds carried the image to lower levels, where people who had never seen the Senate in person watched, and told one another that order had returned, and that their rent would still be due next week, and that perhaps that was order too. On Mustafar, machines whispered in a register below pain. A man breathed for the first time with a noise that would become an anthem and a punishment. The Emperor stood beside him and considered which version of my friend would be most effective for this new life. He settled for silence. Some victories do not need words. They feed on quiet. On Alderaan, a child discovered that hands can make shadow animals on a wall, even when there is no sun, only lamplight, and began to trust the intelligence of her own fingers. On Tatooine, another child found that twin suns hurt the eyes unless one learns to squint like a native, and that native is a language a boy can learn if he listens to wind with his skin. In a hut on Dagobah that had learned the shape of the man who had built it, Yoda sat with a kettle that had decided to sing as if the world deserved a song. He poured water over leaves and let it cool to the precise temperature at which bitterness becomes blessing. He drank and closed his eyes, and felt the galaxy not as a problem to solve, but as a creature to accompany through pain. He did not forget the red blade. He did not forgive the hand that held it. Forgiveness is not forgetting or excusing. It is the refusal to let hatred be the only story one tells about an enemy. Because hatred is lazy, and the living force is not. He held that refusal with the firmness of an old man's grip on a railing. He did not let go. He practiced, daily, the art of holding. He went in his mind sometimes to the Senate rotunda, and stood in the center where he had placed his knees on stone and offered not defeat, but a different sentence. He relit that green hum only in memory, and only to correct the part of himself that wished for a cleaner ending. He told that part of himself the truth. Clean endings are for fables. Life provides compost instead, and compost is how gardens happen. He listened, often, for the immensity of a sound that would one day arrive, when two lights, once in one body, and now in two, learned to call each other across rooms called battlefields and living rooms and prisons and thrones. He did not hurry the day. He counted, instead, each moth that visited his lamp and each frog that added a syllable to the swamp's evening language. The clones, far away, grew into men inside armor, and then were replaced by others who had been born differently and taught obedience with different textbooks. Some of the originals removed their helmets in rooms where no one would see them and cut their hair with knives, not meant for hair, and looked into reflective panels and said a name that had been denied them, and then put the helmets back on and went to work. Some did not. The Emperor's machine was tidy and did not pause to admire its own tidiness. Baal and Brahea stood at windows and learned the measure of years by watching a girl argue with tutors and maps and the nature of yes. Obi-Wan learned the ethics of purchase in a place where coins are sometimes more honest than people. He bought water with work and learned that work can sweeten water. He stood on a ridge and watched moisture harvesters catch the size of a stingy sky, and smiled, once into wind that carried sand the way a disapproving ant carries news. Yoda lay on his back on a pallet that had been softened by ferns and by the patience of a back that had remembered how to rest. He looked through the roof beams at the place where the swamp had decided there would be a gap. Stars laid themselves out professionally. He made no wishes. He made a promise. "Hold," he said aloud, not to the stars and not to himself only, but to the vast middle of things where the Force breathes most contentedly. "Hold, I will. With me, hold if you will." And in 1,000 small places, thousands of small lives consented to the holding without knowing they had been asked. A worker took a longer route home to see if a certain alley cat would be at a certain corner, and found that the cat had delivered kittens. A mechanic tightened a bolt, one extra turn, because his grandfather had taught him that machines prefer devotion to obedience. A storm changed its mind and went inland where it could spend itself on rocks instead of villages. Time did what time does, which is not to pass, but to teach. Yoda learned again and again how to be the size of a hand on a child's back, guiding them across the street, even when the child was on Alderaan, and the hand could never be physically present. He learned again and again how to be the weight in a word that transforms advice into consent. He learned again and again how to be the silence after a sentence in which the better thought finally arrives. Sometimes he stood in the doorway of the hut and looked toward a corner where a knotted root rose like a shoulder, and he saw, for one heartbeat, a boy wearing black and a mask and a cape, and he spoke to that boy without anger. He said nothing. He let the quiet be a chair beside a bed where a man in pain could sit without being asked to explain himself. Then the swamp returned, and the root was only root, and he did not regret the kindness, because kindness is never wasted, even when it is unclaimed. Qui-Gon left him once, for what felt like a long while, and then returned as if he had gone to stir a stew on another stove and discovered it did not require stirring after all. "You worry less," he said without greeting. "Practice." "I have," Yoda said. "And you will need it." "No, I do." They said nothing further because men with fewer years than theirs ruin good silences with explanations, and these two had earned the right to spend a silence generously. When he dreamed, Yoda did not dream of the duel in the Senate. He dreamed of a hand releasing a blade to catch a wrist. He dreamed of a child with water on her cheeks, speaking sternly to a room and making the room better by the sternness. He dreamed of sand that did not crunch between the teeth because someone had learned how to keep it out with cloth and with care. He dreamed of a machine learning to remove a mask for reasons other than comfort. He woke most mornings with the taste of these dreams in his mouth and poured water and did not spit. He drank. He went out and listened to frogs hold their parliament. He thanked them for teaching him the forms. On Coruscant, a statue's nose chipped. A worker drew near with a ladder and a pot of glue and repaired the nose with reverence, because even an empire's craftsmen honor their crafts. The statue did not know the difference. People did. They told the story of the glued nose to one another, because stories need places to hide. Hidden in that story, a joke grew. Hidden in the joke, a revolt considered its options and decided to wait. And in a swamp unchanged by applause, Yoda breathed. And the breath was a labor and a liturgy. And the day did what it needed to do without asking anyone's permission. He let it. He held. He waited without waiting. And beneath the waiting grew something that will be called patience by some and stubbornness by others, and a kind of love by those who have no other word big enough. Far away, a girl on a balcony felt the wind press against her face like a hand pushing her gently toward a life she had not yet named, and found that instead of fear, she felt appetite. Far away, a boy removed a power converter from a housing and replaced it without dropping a single screw, and sat back and smiled at the competence, and at the thought that competence might be a kind of prayer. Yoda washed a cup and set it precisely where it belonged, and looked at his hut, and at the door, and at the path, and at the swamp, and said to all of them indistinguishably, "Ready we will be." Then he laughed, the brief unmusical bark of a creature surprised by its own contentment. And in the laugh was the exact measure of the distance between despair and hope, which is not great, only difficult. Night fell in Dagobah as if it were falling everywhere at once. It was not. It only felt like that because sometimes the Force permits illusions of unity as a consolation prize when unity cannot be had. He accepted the prize and did not resent it. He sat. He listened. In the Senate, lights dimmed according to schedule. In palaces, guards took their posts. In alleyways, mothers whispered into hair. In deserts, men rolled onto their sides and found small cooler places to lay their faces. In ships crossing long darkness, dials kept their promises. In huts smelling of tea and patience, old hands lay upon old knees, and both thought themselves exactly where they should be. He did not plan. He did not predict. He consented. And in the consent, a path widened underfoot that had not been there before, and yet had always been there, and it led forward, and forward has always been another word for mercy.